Really, really happy to have you here today. So we'll drive and dive straight into it. And I'll let my co-host introduce himself first, and then I'll go ahead.
So hi everybody. Some of you may know me already. My name is Anders. I founded Focal Point after spending 25 years in procurement. So I've been Chief Procurement Officer and leader of procurement for companies such as Fannie Mae, QBE, Webster Bank, Citizens Bank, and the list goes on. And it was my experience as a procurement practitioner that made me want to start Focal Point. So very happy to have you guys here, and I would love to understand where you guys are coming in from. So if you can drop your location in the chat, that would be gratefully appreciated. And over to you, Joel.
Thanks so much, Anders. And yeah, Joël Collin-Demers. So I'm the head editor at the Pure Procurement newsletter and also a solo consultant for ProcureTech. So I've been helping organizations for the past 13 years make sense of their IT landscapes, their business objectives, and then plug the two together to say, hey, where do we go from here, right? What's the roadmap for technology that's going to enable us to get new business capabilities, execute on our strategy, and ultimately be a value creator for the business as the procurement function. So really glad to be collaborating on this, Anders. And so just to make sure that, a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the content, who is this webinar for, right? So if you're sitting here watching us yap away, right? If you're a procurement and IT professional or IT professional that has a general understanding of procurement process orchestration, this webinar is for you, right? It's about how to justify the investment in these types of technologies. I think, intuitively when we see demos, we go, oh my God, that's awesome, right? I'd love to have something like that. But then how do we actually build the case for change in our organization, especially when procurement process orchestration probably means nothing to anybody outside of procurement. If you don't know what procurement process orchestration is, Focal Point and myself have a lot of content on the basics, the introductions to that, right? So you can search there for more details. Essentially, it's really around plugging together, coordinating together stakeholders, systems, and processes so that you're able to get the most efficient function around collaboration around your procurement processes. So a very, very high level in a nutshell. That's how I would term it. I don't know, Anders, if you'd add anything to that definition.
Well, it's really, procurement has been orchestrating stuff since you and I have been in procurement as practitioners, right? So we always made sure that the process got executed from left to right, but it was done largely manually, poorly, and mostly in Excel. And procurement orchestration brings together not just the data sources and the data, but also the process flow and systematize it so that it's easier to execute, easier to know who to engage where, when, and where in the process, and so on and so forth. And it's really about thinking about how do you set up a process so that it can be executed consistently and rapidly using a system rather than manual processes, at a nutshell.
Yeah, and allowing variability and accounting for the realities of procurement. Great stuff. And so the quote I wanted to start off with, it's something I've said in the past, right? But it's that no executive outside of procurement has ever woken up excited about procurement orchestration, ever, right? They probably don't even know what it is. And so as we're discussing it, I'm sure there's people on the call who have seen demos, are wondering how they can get their hands on something like this, right? And you see the value, but everybody outside of procurement, they don't know what the heck we're talking about, right? And so today's session, the objective, if I look at the agenda, is really, well, how do we make the case for procurement process orchestration outside of procurement, right? To our chief financial officer, to our chief information officer, to our chief operating officer, and others in the business who are key stakeholders and purse holders and budget holders. Then how do we quantify that business case, right? What are the hard benefits that come from a solution like this? What are the benchmarks we should be keeping in mind and working towards and using as the basis for our business case? And then the soft benefits as well, which can be very important depending on your culture. Then we'll go through an actual example, right? There's many ways to build a business case. We've picked one that we'll develop for you today. And then looking at deployment plan as well, right? Because it's one thing to build a business case, like here's what the value would be at maturity. And then it's another thing to lay it out on a deployment timeline and say, here's how we're going to actually get it to completion and the impact of that on getting to those benefits. And then we'll just bring it all together. Anders will give us a little conclusion there at the end. And I've put a little reminder to let you know that there is live Q&A, right? So we can see folks from Texas, from Canada, from Vietnam in the chat, Bulgaria, Denmark. So quite an international audience already. If you have questions as we're going along, feel free to ask them. And if we have the time to, if it makes sense in context, we'll try to pull it in and answer it live. So
even New Jersey, it's crazy.
Yeah. Exotic New Jersey. So from there, let's get into the content. So how do we make the case for procurement process orchestration, right? So even if you've got very supportive executives outside procurement, at the end of the day, everybody has biases, right? And what your executives end up caring about, what motivates them to act, is their own objectives. And so whether that's managing costs, reducing risks, improving operational efficiency, or delivering value to stakeholders, right? The EBITDA or earnings per share, et cetera. Your ability to get someone to act outside procurement is to be able to tie what you're trying to do and your objectives to theirs, right? Speak their language. And so folks want to eliminate unplanned spending surprises that blow your budgets, right? Or shadow technology purchases for your CIO that create security vulnerabilities, integration nightmares, and high maintenance costs. Supplier failures on the operations side that shuts down a plant or a production line, right? Project delays and the endless threads of emails and meetings to try to track down what happened, why it happened, how can we make sure it doesn't happen again, and or just coordinating the response to an emergency, right? And so these are the things that we want to tailor for. We want to tailor our business case to, and we want to tailor our messaging to as well. And so just, when we think about the CFO, how can we give them real-time visibility and control over spending before spend happens? For the CIO, how do I get them away from chaos and emergencies and high maintenance costs and fire drills, and give them more time to innovate and actually simplify their landscape, for example? And then the chief operating officer, how do I reduce disruptions, resolve issues faster, and proactively prevent operational failures? And so at the end of the day, it's all about business outcomes, right? It's all about how do I produce those business outcomes, and predictive procurement orchestration, or PPO, is how you would do that, right? The vision that Anders laid out for us around seamless coordination of processes, visibility, and never having to ask that question of where's my request, whose desk is it sitting on, what is happening, never having to ask those questions ever again, because everyone who needs visibility has the visibility they need, and everything is getting shipped from one person to the next as they need to be involved, is really what produces those outcomes. And so that's how I would invite you to think about building your business case. And from there, we can actually get into the nuts and bolts, and I'll hand it over to you, Anders, to do that.
Yeah, so as you think about quantifying business cases, right, there are hard and soft benefits. And oftentimes, soft benefits can merge into hard benefits. And we're going to talk a little bit about both, and we're going to talk about how we can structure a business case sort of quantifiably, right? Because oftentimes procurement benefits are doubted. And I think as we've created a framework for business case benefits, you can sort of rinse and repeat that as you want to invest in other infrastructure for your organization. So if you can sort of click forward. And this little eye chart here is really around how we have created a topology or a tree about benefits, right? So there's cost reductions, time savings, and risk mitigation. And the hardest benefits are obviously on the cost reduction side, right? So it's about making sure that you're doing business with the right suppliers, using the right deals, making sure that you have the ability to accrue and not necessarily duplicate things, and then additional savings that happen as part of that, right? So if you think about orchestration, let's pick any topic, whether that's sourcing or procurement intake or supplier management. As you're thinking about all these three things, there are lots of manual tasks that aren't necessarily systematized, that can be streamlined and automated to drive cost savings. So making sure that as you're sitting down with your suppliers, you're doing a QBR, if you can tell the supplier what the on-contract versus off-contract percentages are right up front and how you can drive on-contract percentages, that's a beautiful thing. And that will then help you save real dollars at the bottom line. So if you look at the topology chart here, we have included some examples of how we would then quantify and justify cost reductions in each of these 4 buckets. Now, obviously, there are more buckets under cost reductions. And as you start thinking about it, for example, higher compliance with the business, higher compliance with preferred providers, those kinds of things, that could be another driver of those things that will then help contract compliance and then drive further cost savings, right? The next benchmark here is time savings. And this is a squishy thing that you have to sort of start thinking about. And as I was in procurement, we always talked about, is this a body or is it a torso or is it an arm or a leg sort of thing in terms of cost savings? I know that's obviously very sort of tongue in cheek, right? But what we have found is folks that integrate and automate sourcing, for example. So if you can have a sourcing process that automatically guides people to the preferred providers and then automatically helps you then select diverse suppliers without having to look for it, and all those things take time. And if you can automate that and help folks figure things out, you can save significant amounts of time and then drive folks to doing more value-added things. So what we want to say here is the more time you can save in time savings, the more time you can then work on having cost reduction or strategic stuff done rather than tactical things done. And that could be having touch-free rec-to-PO processes. It could be not spending a lot of time searching Oracle supplier masters, but having that stuff brought to you instead. And then having, touchless supplier onboarding. And all of these things are done manually, poorly in Excel, like I talked about earlier. And the more stuff you can automate to free up time to do value-added things is time well spent. Last but not least, risk mitigation, right? So I've been working for financial services and insurance for quite a bit of time. And we had to deal with wonderful agencies such as the OCC that would come in on a periodic basis and audit us. And let me tell you, when you get one of those wonderful audit reports, and maybe even an MRA, which is a matter requiring attention, that's board attention, all of a sudden bad things happen, right? To the extent to which you can eliminate those things altogether is a beautiful thing. The problem is procurement hardly ever gets credit for the accident or mishap that was avoided. So it's a matter of putting that in people's minds to say, look, we can have more suppliers be validated. We can make sure they are compliant with whatever guidelines we put forth, whether that's risk, insurance certificate collection, SOC 2 reviews, anything like that. And having something that you can mitigate that risk. And trust me, the board, no one in the C-suite want a bad audit report from your regulators, right? So the more you think about those things, the better off you will be. So those are the things I would talk about for hard benefits.
And can I just add, Anders, like on the time savings piece, and I know you mentioned it, but I want to highlight it because it's super important, is like time savings on its own usually isn't enough to convince an executive that a project is worthwhile. It's more, hey, here's the time we'll save, and here's how we're redeploying it to new spend under management, new categories that we're not actually tackling today, better negotiation or compliance with existing strategies, with business units that we're not giving any attention to, right? And so you really need to be creative. That's where the creativity comes into play, is being able to say, how do we redeploy those time savings to something that's going to give us another portion of benefits, right? And so you never really just hang on to one of these buckets, but you end up touching on all three if you want a winning business case. And so if you're really mature in an area, then potentially you're on the low end of the benchmark, or you're not including it at all. Whereas if opportunity exists, you're very immature, then you're able to go towards the top of those benchmarks when you're crafting your business case and say, okay, I think we could go, we can faster. We're doing the supplier onboarding manually in Excel with email and phone calls today. If we use a platform to do that, yeah, we could get 50% faster for sure, right? So I just wanted to call that out, Anders, before moving on to the soft benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the soft benefits, we all we all strive towards this, right? So one of the things that we are tracking for some of our customers is a net promoter score. And it's basically a one question survey at the end of an interaction with procurement and say, how well did we do today? Like, and then we sort of say, it's people in the middle that, yeah, it was okay. And the people that are ecstatically happy and people that are not. And the net promoter score is sort of telling you like what percentage of folks are net promoters, right? So we've seen this in customer satisfaction surveys as well as internal surveys. So that's one of the things that we track. And what we're finding here is that net promoter scores is an indicator for how well procurement is received and how willing people are to come back to procurement to receive help. And as we all know, we've had the angry users that hate procurement, and there's not much you can do to help them, right? So, but at the end of the day, if there's a groundswell of people that are raving proponents of procurement, that's what we strive towards. So the enhanced user experience should not be underestimated because that helps compliance. And if the easiest path is also the right path, that's going to make people want to take it. And I think part of the problem today is that some organizations create these monumental policies that are extremely hard to follow without any real help. So it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask to do the right thing. And that's what we try to do with procurement orchestration. You try to make it such that the easiest way is the right way. And then you have the strategic benefits, right? So having the right data-driven decision-making, shifting things from tactical to strategic, and then having a proper alignment. If it's easier to use your internal accepted and approved providers that are strategic to you, the better off you are, the shorter path from A to Z. And people are going to want to use that again and again. And I've seen some organizations, as we are setting up their processes, they say, well, I want to make it very clear that if you use a non-preferred provider, so we have to go through the onboarding process, will take this amount of time, and it will require this amount of red tape versus using one of the internal providers that already can provide that service. And that's a very strong to sort of indicator. Say, you know what, I don't want to go through the six-month process of onboarding a new supplier if I can use one that we have. Now, the irony here is also through orchestration, we can make that 6-month process much, much shorter. But of course, it doesn't drive the compliance that you're after, right? And then obviously you want to make sure that as you're doing these kinds of things, the enhanced organizational alignment would also help be a good thing, right? So as you sort of think about a procurement process, procurement is very much a team sport. So we can't do procurement without, involving risk, compliance, IT, any of the sort of what I would call procurement adjacent functions. And if they have a better way and a better solution where they can interact with procurement and procurement stakeholders and procurement clients, the better off it is. Now, again, getting raging fans is a beautiful thing. And I think procurement orchestration is one of those things that can help drive that, across the organization. And those are the soft benefits that will then drive things that would go into hard benefits. You probably have a lot to say there, Joel.
No, well, I would add that, so one of the books that I read on this topic that changed completely how I think about it is How to Measure Anything. And essentially it's like, you were speaking to NPS score, for example, like there's a way for me to measure NPS score over time and to tie that to, for example, contract compliance, right? And say like, if I'm able to bump up the NPS score, here's kind of the impact that isn't necessarily 100%, but we see a correlation with contract compliance, right? Because people want to use the system, it becomes the easiest way to do things, and so it has a hard benefit impact at the end of the day, right? And so being creative on, okay, how do we don't need a perfect measure, right? But how do we measure something over time, either with survey or with observation or what have you, and trend it over time and be able to tie it to other metrics so that these soft benefits become hard benefits or can be tied to hard benefits, right? So being creative around, if a soft benefit is not landing as something valuable within your company culture, how do I tie it to something that is, right? Because every company has a culture where certain value levers are more important than others, right? And so depending on the data that you have, or don't have, how can we turn things into data so that we can then justify putting the investment in a way that resonates with the business.
Okay.
Yeah, and so if we were to take what Anders just laid out and walk through an example, so I love Sankey diagrams, and I put one here just to illustrate, right? Like if we were to build a business case around the contract compliance value lever, for example, at full maturity, right? So once everything is deployed with a solution like Focal Point, let's take a global industrial manufacturing company with about 4.2 billion in annual addressable spend. All right, so let's say they're at 58% contract compliance, so they are measuring that with their existing tools, and they're able to get a good handle on what is compliant with contracts. But that also means that the 42% that's remaining, right? So the 1.76 billion is escaping these preferred purchasing channels. It's not going on contract. To go back to what you were saying, at the very outset of the webinar, Anders. Right. And so there's leakage there. There's value leakage. We're buying stuff that we could be buying another way, and we could get the exact same thing, exact same quality, but at a cheaper price if we had only put it through the correct purchasing channel. And so each non-compliant purchase we can see costs us on average 5% more than negotiated rates. Right. So if you're doing this within your own business, you're going and pulling this data to bring this together. And so if we look at the diagram here, right, we have 2.436 billion, or 58% of the total spend that's compliant, and then 1.764 that's not compliant, or 42%, right? And so if I think about, okay, I go do my market research, I look at the licensing cost for one of these tools and the fact that it'd be able to give me that additional compliant spend, let's say 22% here in our business case, so an additional 924 million in compliant spend. That breaks out to, okay, there's the spend itself, but then there's my recurring savings of 5%, which is about $45.2 million a year on that spend. And then I can self-fund in those savings my license costs and my one-time implementation costs for a tool like this, right? And so it becomes very, very compelling in terms of, okay, right, like yes, there's risk when putting a tool in place, and there's project management to do and all this good stuff, but it's a fairly easy business case to demonstrate with one of those value levers, right? And then if it needs to become more compelling, then I can go and pull on other value levers as well as I build my model to explain how and why we should be doing this. And then it's all about messaging, right? How do I turn this around and say, okay, what does this mean for the CIO? It means that we can actually focus on identifying, okay, what is our ticketing app? If we have 7 of them, right, we'll connect to it and make sure that IT privacy impact assessments are done in that one ticketing app, and everything else we could kind of get rid of as we centralize that function, right? And same thing with legal or with other things, right? So orchestration is really around being purposeful with the processes we're going to put in place. And so for the CIO, that'd be one of the messaging factors that could be a soft benefit, right? Standardization of applications. They may get hard benefits from portfolio optimization later down the line, but you don't have to make your business case out of it. So anyways, just a quick example of where you can start from, and then you could start tacking other things onto it based on what is relevant to the stakeholders that need to approve the project, while keeping it as simple as possible, right? Because the last thing you want is like some huge business case that's very hard to track afterwards. Anything you want to add, Anders, on how you'd build a business case in this example or otherwise?
Well, I think you build a business case also around having structured information, so that things aren't sitting in Excel spreadsheets or SharePoint drives, those kinds of things. Like you have a good place to find things for future audits and for how decisions were made and those kinds of things, right? So, and with that also comes the possibility of retiring legacy platforms that are just utilized because they're there, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's, I think, how a lot of things end up in SharePoint these days. So, thinking about that as well. So I think, you make the business case depending on what hurts in the organization, and there's not a one size fits all. And that's why it's so important to think about all the drivers, right?
Yeah, and then to pick, and that's why I think this morning I posted in before this webinar that building a business case is an art, in the sense where it needs to be based on the pain and the value drivers that are important in the culture of your business. But then, you have the two trees that we put together so that you're able to go pick and choose based on what is relevant to you. And so while the numbers are compelling, this real story is how orchestration is going to translate to and transform your operations for these different functions, right? We use the executives as like the personas, but could be directors. You need to speak the language of your other stakeholders, right? So for finance, we're able to see 80% of spend that's going to be visible before commitment, right? So if it's compliant, it means it went through the proper purchasing channel, which means we have the correct approvals before going out, right? It increases forecasting accuracy, proactive management. For the CIO, every single technology purchase is routed through a process for technology purchases. We have the right security reviews. There's less emergency initiatives. Operational resilience is stronger. So that's how you want to message to IT. And then your operations, right? Like, how are we reducing supplier-related disruptions, and the resolution time as well, because we have all the stakeholders that were, for example, related to that stakeholder relationship in our tools as well. And so once you have that, then the question becomes, and Anders, I'll turn it over to you in terms of your perspective on deployment plans, but it becomes, okay, well, if we have that 42 million from my example, that's going to be our recurring savings at maturity, like, how do we get there? And that's the deployment plan.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge, or the biggest thing we try to avoid as we advise customers and prospects about how to go live is don't try to eat the elephant in one bite. It's basically getting quick time to value is number one thing. So we have one customer that started UAT this morning, and they are a 11,000 employee professional services company, and we went live with them, or we're having UAT now 4 weeks after we started the project, and they were 4 weeks, not 4 months. And they very much went after, the intake part of the equation. It's like, we need to solve that first so that we can then know what's coming in the funnel and how to dispose of those things as they're coming into the funnel. And, phase one for them was really like pinpointing what hurts the most and go fix that first, and then build future downstream. So for them, phase one is going to be putting the foundation in place, getting 11,000 users set up in the system so that they can start using it and start interacting with procurement. The next phase for them is then taking all the stuff they learned from phase one and building their procurement, sourcing, and supplier management processes into the tool. So that once people get into the sourcing process, the users requesting the service will then understand where the things are sitting in the pipeline and how it's being disposed of, so to speak. And then phase three for them will be to do more on the category management side and pulling in strategies and managing metrics and all those kinds of things. So we chose sort of like rather than using a small segment of the organization to go after, like we chose a small process to go after and expanding that as we went down. But there's not a one size fits all here. It's more about how do you find time to value and what that means for the organizations. And I think some organization will say, well, I want to go all in with one category or one business unit. Well, that's admirable, and that also works. Also starting small from a process perspective also works. So it's basically, how do you get to that full deployment, full value in a short amount of time? And if you can prove as part of phase one that this is really worth investing in, you can build some excitement and hype in the organization and get good suggestions and good sponsors along the way. But there is no one size fits all, and it's really like a consultative way. And I think that's what sets Focal Point aside, is we don't come in with pre-baked processes and say, all right, this is best in class, you should be doing this. We sort of take a step back and say, well, where does it hurt? What do you want to fix, and how can we help you get there? Now, of course, we also have pre-baked processes, but we don't come in guns blazing saying that this is how you should do it because we're right. We take a step back and try to figure out like what works for that organization.
And it's funny you mentioned that, right? Because I think I mentioned this yesterday in a meeting with a client where I was going like, every implementation is essentially a world first, right? Like, because you've got a different org structure, different set of systems in the background. different strategy and objectives that you're trying to get to versus a competitor in the same industry, right? And so there's always a combination of factors that make it that you're essentially in a unique position or in a unique context. That being said, I think you want to tend towards using best practices for sure, and coming to the table with those as a starting point. But there is always a bit of fit that needs to happen from both ends to get to the outcome that you want, right? And so I appreciate that point you're making, Anders. I had a question for you, or unless you want to add to that first.
I used to have a boss back when I worked for Bank of Montreal, and he used to say everybody's special. Some are more special than others, right? And I think that's still true.
Oh, for sure. And it's finding that balance, right? Because you don't want to be too special where you're doing stuff that is so unique that it's heavy, right? It's because you've been doing it the same way for a long time. Like I remember just a quick anecdote where I remember working with an insurance firm where after contracts had been written, there was like a 3-day or signed. There was a 3-day waiting period before the contracts were activated. And this was a really, really old, like 100-year-old company. And I kept asking why this delay, and never got a satisfactory answer. And we eventually worked it up to like they were paper contracts before, and so there was a delay to just ship to wait for the contracts to get shipped and for like the inks to sign and all that, right? and they had just kept that delay for no reason over time. Like, oh, we wait 3 days before we activate the contracts, right? And so you don't want to get too special. You don't want to get special to that point.
Nope.
And then the question I had for you on the UAT example you were giving earlier is for that I was curious about that specific client. Like, are they standing up procurement from nothing? Like, is it a new function, or is it an old function that they're trying to give new capabilities to?
It's a relatively new function in a company that's been growing by acquisition quite aggressively. They're trying to get things normalized.
Okay, cool. That gives good context as well. And to add like to this deployment plan thinking, right? Like I always try to bring it back to business units and spend categories. And so in a very mature organization, like you might have to hit a business unit first, right? And then give them a tool that's going to allow them to support 100% of their requests for the different types of categories or different things that they buy. And so some people get bogged down in, we have to design processes for IT, for human resources, for professional services, for staffog, for X, Y, and Z. And you get like this huge barrier to entry in their mind. And what a trick that I've seen is being able to, and I'd love your feedback on it, Anders, but is going, okay, well, what's like the 5-6 categories that represents 80% of the spend? And let's map those out, but then let's just have a catch-all process where it's more generic, and we can put a human in the loop to action it. But we have that structure around, say, IT purchases, right, where we're looping in IT, and we've already got that in the process. But we give ourselves a way to cover 100% of the spend without having to define 100% of the processes per spend category. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we can bore everyone to tears here about setting up procurement processes, right? But what we tend to do is set up a base process that can then be contextually and conditionally flexing up and down depending on the category, the risk, the geography, whatever the case may be. But I find that very few organizations are ready for that discussion on day one.
But that's, and to me, that's, if we look at this other model here, that's what the considerations become when you get to that deployment plan discussion, right? Before you even get here, you need to think about, okay, what's the business case at the end of the day, right? And then this is more, okay, well, how do we deploy it, and what is the impact on spreading that business case over time? And I think I'd leave this topic, unless there's questions in the chat, on trying to do that hockey stick growth of your business case, right? So to your point, giving yourself time to start small, right? And you may not see huge benefits at the beginning, but it gives you that solid base that creates excitement and that proves the concept. And then you're able to deploy it either multiple business units at the same time, multiple categories at the same time, and get all the spend that's going to drive the benefits from your business case, but it gives you that time to experiment and get it right before you open the floodgates, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and so bringing it all together here, Anders, like what would be your key takeaways for if I'm sitting in the audience here wanting to build my procurement process orchestration business case?
Well, I would first of all figuring out like what are the pain points of the organization? So what are people complaining about the most? And what will it get you if and when you solve those things? And then you need to figure out, okay, how are you going to solve those things? And being able to tell that story that, okay, I have this problem, I want to solve it this way. And that's just want to give this is the outcome that will get to you, Mr. CEO, CFO, COO, whatever the case may be. And then you need to sort of paint the picture and tell the story about what the future looks like once that's there and the benefits for them. So everyone cares about what's in it for me. But executives will care about that, but also how it will impact their people, which again, we'll come back to that indirectly. So that is really the story that you want to start telling as part of the business case.
And just to tack on to the end there, then it becomes crunchy. Like if you've sold that project, the questions will start strong and fast around, okay, well, what about, how are you actually going to roll this out? And what's the plan for that? And so as soon as you get these crunchier questions, you know that you're on the right path in my mind, right? That once you start getting challenged, it's because the stakeholders are engaged and they want to know, okay, how do we actually make this a reality? And they start testing you on, have you thought this through, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's where knowing your numbers well, knowing the interrelationship and making sure you're not double dipping on benefits, right? So if you're actioning multiple value levers, you're not double counting certain savings or certain benefits that you would be getting. And then thinking about, okay, well, we would actually, how would we actually get this into a productive state, right? Or a live state so that people are using it, and how are we giving each other and the business the time to adopt this correctly without breaking our face, right? Because the tendency, and I don't know if you've seen this, Anders, with clients, is like on paper, the fastest way to get the most benefits is like to put the most amount of scope at the beginning of a deployment plan. And so it's very alluring. It's very tempting to do that. But to me, it's like the easiest way to break your face with a project like this. Yeah. So I'm curious to know if you came across that in the wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's procurement people tend to be idealistic, as a people, and very optimistic, right? And people want to go to the perfect process with the perfect stakeholder mapping, with all like everything baked in. It just, the truth is, it just takes too long. And the amount of resistance you'll get from internal stakeholders to go, I need to do my process in your solution now, and without them having an idea of what it looks like and how much better it is, it's kind of hard to bring them along the journey with you. So I think starting small is the way to go. But yeah, we've gotten stuck in processes where perfection is the enemy of great or even good enough, right? And that usually takes a long time, and it's a much harder way of getting to the end point than sort of slow and steady, right? And it's kind of like, if you want to lose weight, I'm going to pick at myself here for a minute, right? Like you can not eat for 2 weeks and you can probably lose a lot of weight, but it's not healthy. But you can, just decrease your consumption a little bit and do healthy stuff. It probably gets you there, and it's longer term better for you and everybody else. And it's probably not a good analogy, but hopefully you get it.
Yeah, but it actually leads, because I see we have a bit of time here. And if you have questions, guys, make sure to put them in the chat, and we'll have time to get to them. But is like, once we've talked about building the case for change, the value levers that you can pull on, and then how to actually deploy that to get live. I'm curious to get your perspective on, like, once a customer is live, how do they maintain? What are the good habits they need to maintain to keep that weight off, right? To go on your analogy a bit further, right? How do I make sure that the investment we put into this tool keeps realizing my savings over time?
Well, I think a couple of things, right? So continuing to build on the platform is been what we have seen the most of, right? So once you get your first few processes up and running and people understand how to build their own processes and configure their own processes, we find that folks in the wild are basically starting to use the solution for things that they weren't originally envisaged for. We have customers who have come to us and say, oh, look, now we have items reconciliation on the solution, and we can pull a trigger off of this system to run this workflow, and then we can, and I'm like, oh my God, like I never thought that this was a use case for the tool. So because we don't charge for extra users or extra processes or extra spend, people are then starting to think about how can we use the solution for more things, across the organization, not just in procurement as well. And I think that's very healthy because number one, for us, the tool gets stickier. And number two, it increases the ROI for the purchaser even more. And people have one place to work, which is kind of cool. So what I would say is that as long as you start thinking and continuing to innovate, it's a beautiful thing. And you can do stuff with the solution that you didn't originally think it could be doing, right? The second thing, and this is motherhood and apple pie for procurement people, right, is once you source something, you also want to make sure you manage the deal post-signature. And I think that is the other thing that sort of comes to mind is if you think about it as a sourcing tool or as first of all, if you think about it as a transaction processing tool, it can be done like that, but that's not really what procurement's all about, right? That's purchasing. But then you start sourcing stuff and okay, you get more value from there. But after that, you also want to manage those transaction post-contract. And I think that is also how you maintain and retain those savings going forward as well.
Yeah, and so I love that you're essentially telling me that the premise of my question was wrong, which is I say like, how do I retain the value from the business case? And you're telling me so that it doesn't degrade. And you're telling me actually what we're seeing with the most successful clients is that they figure out a way to keep increasing ROI on the tool while using it because they, essentially when you get in there, you see all the potential for additional value. And to your point, right, you've paid for the sandbox, and so you can build the sandcastle that to your heart's content. That's great. And I see we have a question here. Let me just go to the end slide here. So as we're going through questions here, we have 2 QR codes for you. First of all, thank you for being here. On the left-hand side, you can subscribe to the Pure Procurement newsletter. It's so funny because I founded my company during COVID and I didn't say it out loud because nobody was talking to each other. And I didn't realize it was a tongue twister until 2023, but it is. But if you want to follow the newsletter weekly, give you little tips and tricks on how to leverage technology to get results in your procurement business. And then on the right-hand side, everything we've covered today and more, like talk tracks with your executives, what your CEO could say at the end of an implementation of a tool like this on an earnings call or a shareholder meeting or even a board meeting. That's all in the brand new ebook that Focal Point is releasing today, based on how to build your business case. So it's really a step-by-step that's a bit more detailed than what we covered today on how to build your business case. So if what we discussed today resonated, you can grab it with the QR code here. And I'm sure Maya and the team at Focal Point will also be distributing it through their normal channels on email and LinkedIn and all that good stuff. So watch out for it as you get feedback from this webinar. So just wanted to get that out of the way. I'll leave it on screen so that folks can grab it. But Fetahali, and I hope I'm saying that right, had one question. I don't know whether or not my question is relevant, but what is the single most important problem in procurement? I'll throw that one to you, Anders, because I know you probably have a perspective on this, there's not one, but.
Yeah, so I've built procurement organizations many times in the past, right? And it really depends on the maturity that you're at. If you're just starting out and you're coming in with a green field, then it's really figuring out where your money's being spent and the commitments that you have already, right? So we're helping a customer right now. Basically, it's a $2.8 billion company, and they're setting up a procurement organization for the first time. And they really want to figure out where are they spending their money and what do they have contracts with. Once that's been sorted out, then you need to figure out what are the opportunities that you can have either for increased compliance or savings or whatever the case may be. But really what you need to figure out at the beginning is what is the current landscape, and then where do I want to get to and how am I going to get there? And I think it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but it's true. And the more mature you get, the problems get smaller, typically speaking, because you've solved a lot of things and it's a journey, right? And what I will say is this, very few people get points for perfect procurement. You should probably never strive for perfect, but you want to strive for good enough or even great. Because I think that's going to be much more appreciated than having the best intellectual procurement process with everything ticked and tied, right? Because perfection costs a lot of money.
And I love that, right? Because as soon as you say that, my mind goes to like, my 80-20 Pareto rule, right? I probably have 20% of my spend categories where I have 80% of the impact that I'm able to generate as procurement, right, for the business. And so focusing on the other 80% of the spend that we do, like how we're going to get those processes perfect, et cetera, might be nice from a theoretical standpoint, and my desire to do the best work I can do, to get it perfect. But at the same time, is it going to move the needle for the business? Maybe not, right? And so keeping those two things true in my head at the same time, right? My desire to, yes, do good work across the board, but also focus more heavily on the things that are going to move the needle for the business is probably the best thing that someone could do. Now, I apologize, Anders. I just realized that I thought we were going all the way to 1 p.m. here, and folks, I think we only had half an hour on the call, so we'll meet halfway here and end at 12:45. So I hope everybody here had a great time with the webinar, that it provided value. If you have follow-up questions, I know, Anders, we can find you on LinkedIn. You're kicking there, me as well. And so anything around building business cases, if we can help you out, or anything else that we discussed on the call, please do make sure to reach out, and we'll make sure to be in touch and plug you with the right resources if we are not the right resources.
Yeah. And thank you. Thanks for having me, Joel. And if anyone just wants to nerd out about procurement, like, I love doing that stuff. So Fatahali, if I can help you at all, or anyone else for that matter, to reach out. I just love talking about procurement and how we can grow.
And I'll attest to that, which is one of the reasons I enjoy so much collaborating with you, Anders, and the Focal Point team, right? It comes from the heart. So thanks again for being here, everybody. Thanks, Anders, for joining me. And we'll talk to you again next time. Have a great time.
Yes, sir. Thank you, guys. Cheers.